In the first week of March 2026, more than 500,000 people in Lebanon woke up to the sound of airstrikes, packed whatever they could carry, and fled their homes. Not because of a natural disaster, not because of an economic collapse, though Lebanon has had plenty of those. They fled because a fragile ceasefire, one that had barely held for 16 months, shattered overnight. And the reason it shattered is something almost nobody saw coming: the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, in a joint US-Israeli military operation. What followed was not just another flare-up in a long-running border conflict. It was a cascade of decisions by Hezbollah, by Israel, by Washington, by Beirut, that threatens to redraw the strategic map of the entire Middle East. And to understand where this is headed, you need to understand how every piece on the board got here. Let's rewind to November 2024. After months of devastating fighting linked to the broader Gaza conflict, Israel and Hezbollah agreed to a ceasefire. It was imperfect, it was tense, but it held, barely. For over a year, southern Lebanon existed in a kind of suspended animation. Displaced families trickled back to bombed-out villages. UNIFIL peacekeepers patrolled cautiously. The Lebanese armed forces made tentative moves to assert control south of the Litani River. And behind the scenes, diplomats from Washington to Tehran worked channels to keep the lid on. But the lid was never screwed on tight. It was always resting loosely, waiting for the right shock to blow it off. That shock came on March 2nd, 2026. In retaliation for the killing of Khamenei, Hezbollah unleashed a barrage unlike anything seen since the 2006 war. Rockets, missiles, and armed drones. 124 separate attacks by Hezbollah's own count rained down on Israeli military installations, civilian areas, and security targets. For the first time since 2024, projectiles struck central Israel. This was not a symbolic gesture. This was a statement. Hezbollah's new Secretary General, Naim Qassem, went on television 2 days later and framed the entire campaign as a defensive response to what he called American and Israeli aggression. He described it not as an act of Iranian proxy warfare, but as a struggle with a distinctly Lebanese character. Whether anyone outside Hezbollah's base believed that framing is another question entirely. Israel's response was immediate, massive, and precisely calibrated to inflict maximum structural damage on Hezbollah while minimizing Israeli ground casualties. The Israeli Defense Forces launched waves of airstrikes across 3 major zones: the Hezbollah-dominated southern suburbs of Beirut, known as Dahia, the Bekaa Valley, a long-standing logistics corridor, and broad swaths of southern Lebanon below the Litani River. But this was not indiscriminate carpet bombing. The IDF specifically went after Hezbollah's command and control nodes, weapons storage facilities, positions belonging to the elite Radwan force, and, in a move designed to cripple the organization financially, buildings associated with Al-Qard al-Hassan, the quasi-banking network that functions as Hezbollah's financial backbone. The asymmetry in the casualty figures tells a stark story. In the first week alone, unofficial estimates suggest that more than 100 Hezbollah operatives were killed. On the Israeli side, 2 soldiers lost their lives. That ratio reflects a deliberate Israeli strategy: degrade Hezbollah's operational capacity from the air, seize commanding terrain in the south with ground forces to push launch capabilities further from northern Israeli towns, and avoid the kind of prolonged ground invasion that proved so costly in 2006. In military terms, Israel was applying a doctrine of maximum pressure with minimal exposure. And it was working. At least tactically. But wars are never just about tactics. On the ground in Lebanon, the human cost was staggering. By March 8th, just 6 days into the renewed fighting, nearly 400 people had been killed, including 83 children and 42 women. Over 1,100 more were injured. And the displacement numbers were enormous. More than 517,000 people registered as displaced, flooding into Beirut, Mount Lebanon, and points north. Rent prices in the capital and surrounding areas spiked by 400% almost overnight. Lebanon, a country already teetering on the edge of economic ruin after years of financial crisis, political paralysis, and the catastrophic 2020 Beirut port explosion, was being pushed toward a breaking point. This is where the politics inside Lebanon become just as important as the military dynamics. Prime Minister Nawaf Salam, who had taken office amid enormous expectations for reform, found himself in an impossible position. He went public with a message that was unmistakably aimed at Hezbollah. Do not drag Lebanon into another adventure. He pointed directly to the 2023-2024 Gaza-linked conflict, reminding the country of the enormous price Lebanon paid for a war it did not choose. His government took concrete steps that would have been almost unthinkable just a few years earlier. Beirut ordered the expulsion of all Quds Force operatives from Lebanese soil and imposed visa requirements on Iranian citizens, a direct slap at Tehran's decades-long freedom of movement inside Lebanon. Now, this is a genuinely significant shift. For years, successive Lebanese governments either couldn't or wouldn't stand up to Hezbollah on matters of war and peace. The group's military wing operated as a parallel state with its own intelligence apparatus, its own supply chains, and its own foreign policy, essentially independent of the Lebanese government. But the sheer scale of destruction in March 2026 appears to have changed the calculus. There are credible reports of internal criticism within Hezbollah's own traditional support base, the Shia communities in southern Lebanon and Dahiya, who are questioning why they are once again bearing the heaviest burden of a conflict driven by regional, not local, imperatives. That kind of grassroots discontent is not something Hezbollah's leadership can easily ignore, especially when the organization is simultaneously hemorrhaging fighters and infrastructure. To understand why Hezbollah is in a weaker position than it might appear, you need to zoom out and look at what has happened to the broader Iranian axis over the past 2 years. Because the network that once made Hezbollah the most formidable non-state military force on the planet has been systematically dismantled. Start with Syria. In December 2024, Bashar al-Assad was ousted from power. That single event was arguably the most consequential geopolitical shift in the region since the fall of Saddam Hussein. For decades, the Assad regime served as the critical land bridge between Iran and Hezbollah. Weapons, cash, advisors, and strategic directives flowed from Tehran through Damascus and into Lebanon with minimal interference. With Assad gone, that corridor effectively collapsed. Iran can no longer move hardware overland into Lebanon with anything close to the reliability it once enjoyed. And that matters enormously when Hezbollah is burning through munitions at the rate it did in early March. Then there's Iran itself. The regime in Tehran is under extraordinary pressure, domestically and externally. Years of internal repression have not extinguished popular unrest. They've merely driven it underground. The economy remains strangled by sanctions. And now, with the killing of Khamenei, the leadership is in a period of profound uncertainty. Succession struggles, factional infighting, and the sheer psychological blow of losing the supreme leader in what amounts to a military strike have left Iran's foreign policy apparatus scrambling. The result is that Hezbollah's patron is weaker, more distracted, and less capable of providing the sustained logistical and financial support the group depends on than at any point in the past 4 decades. Meanwhile, Washington is playing its own complex game. The Trump administration's approach to Lebanon can best be described as a split screen. On one side, there's robust security assistance flowing to the Lebanese armed forces. In September 2025, a $14 million package went through. A month later, a far more substantial $240 million package followed. The message is clear. Washington wants the LAF to be strong enough to fill the vacuum left by any Hezbollah withdrawal, to deploy credibly south of the Litani, and to enforce the terms of UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which has been more aspiration than reality since it was passed in 2006. The U.S. ambassador in Beirut delivered an equally clear diplomatic message to the Lebanese presidency. Israel will not escalate against Lebanon as long as no hostile acts originate from Lebanese territory. That formulation, conditional restraint, is designed to hand the Lebanese government a lever it can use against Hezbollah internally. If Hezbollah stops, Israel stops. The implication is unmistakable. If Hezbollah doesn't stop, whatever happens next is on them. But here's where the other side of that split screen gets troubling. At the same time that the U.S. is arming the LAF, the Trump administration has frozen most non-security civilian aid to Lebanon. Humanitarian funding, reconstruction money, the kind of assistance that keeps a battered population fed and housed. Much of it has been suspended. In a country with over 500,000 newly displaced people, that decision has consequences that go far beyond budget spreadsheets. It creates a vacuum, and vacuums in the Middle East get filled quickly. Enter Qatar. Doha recently pledged $480 million to rebuild 3 communities in southern Lebanon, plus another $400 million for Lebanon's shattered electricity sector. That is a staggering sum, and it is desperately needed. But there's a catch. Without American involvement in setting performance benchmarks and monitoring where that money actually goes, there is a real risk that reconstruction funds could end up flowing through channels connected to Hezbollah-linked entities. It would not be the first time Gulf reconstruction money was captured by the very networks it was ostensibly meant to bypass. And this is the strategic blind spot in Washington's current approach. You cannot simultaneously withdraw from the civilian side and expect to maintain influence over how Lebanon rebuilds. If you're still with me at this point, and I hope you are, because this is where the analysis gets genuinely critical, let me walk through the 2 most plausible scenarios for how this plays out. The first scenario is the one nobody wants but everyone fears: full regional war. In this scenario, Hezbollah ignores the warnings from Washington and the pleas from its own government. Perhaps Tehran, desperate to avenge Khamenei and reassert deterrence, demands that Hezbollah escalate further. Perhaps hardliners within Hezbollah's own ranks push for a wider campaign. If that happens, Israel has already signaled, through both public statements and private diplomatic channels, that its response would target not just Hezbollah, but Lebanese state infrastructure. We are talking about the airport, the power grid, major transportation corridors. The goal would be to make the cost of hosting Hezbollah so catastrophic that the Lebanese state itself is forced to act. The problem, of course, is that this logic punishes millions of Lebanese civilians who have no say in Hezbollah's decisions. And it risks tipping Lebanon from a struggling state into a fully failed one, with all the refugee flows, instability, and extremist recruitment opportunities that entails. The second scenario is managed de-escalation. In this version of events, several things happen in rough sequence. Hezbollah, reeling from heavy losses, facing internal dissent, and unable to count on reliable resupply from a weakened Iran, makes a pragmatic decision to pull back. The Lebanese armed forces, bolstered by American equipment and training, deploy credibly into the areas south of the Litani that Hezbollah has historically controlled. A renewed ceasefire takes hold, monitored by a reinvigorated UNIFIL presence. And the United States, having established clear conditions, begins to unfreeze civilian aid tied to verifiable progress on disarmament. This is the hopeful scenario. It is also the harder one, because it requires every actor, Hezbollah, the LAF, Israel, Washington, Tehran, to make decisions that prioritize long-term stability over short-term satisfaction. And speaking of UNIFIL, the peacekeeping force deserves attention here because it is in an extraordinarily dangerous position. During the March escalation, 3 UNIFIL personnel were injured when heavy fire struck their base in Al-Qusa. Both Israel and Hezbollah have been accused of violating the terms of Resolution 1701, which UNIFIL is mandated to monitor. If the peacekeepers are forced to withdraw or are rendered operationally irrelevant, the last international tripwire in southern Lebanon disappears. That would make any future ceasefire almost impossible to verify and would dramatically increase the likelihood of miscalculation and renewed fighting. So where does all of this leave us? The honest answer is on a knife's edge. The ceasefire that held from late 2024 through early 2026 was never a peace agreement. It was a pause that both sides used to rearm, reposition, and prepare for the next round. That next round is now here, and it is unfolding against a regional backdrop that has shifted dramatically. Iran is weaker than it has been in decades. Hezbollah is more isolated, more battered, and more politically exposed inside Lebanon than at any point in its history. Israel has demonstrated both the capability and the willingness to impose devastating costs. And the United States is deeply involved militarily, while simultaneously withdrawing from the civilian and diplomatic toolkit that historically gave it leverage. The variables that will determine which scenario prevails are not primarily military. They are political. Can the Lebanese government sustain its pushback against Hezbollah, or will the political class fracture under pressure? Will Tehran demand further escalation as a matter of revolutionary principle, even as its capacity to support that escalation erodes? Will Washington recognize that security assistance without civilian engagement is a strategy with a shelf life? And will the international community muster the will to reinforce UNIFIL and hold both sides accountable to the commitments they have already made on paper? None of these questions have easy answers, but the stakes of getting them wrong are measured in lives. In the hundreds of thousands of Lebanese families sleeping in overcrowded shelters tonight, in the Israeli communities still within rocket range, in the Hezbollah fighters being told to hold positions that may no longer be defensible, and in the UNIFIL soldiers standing watch at bases that have already come under fire. What is clear is that this is not a conflict that will resolve itself through military force alone. Every major escalation in the history of the Israeli-Lebanese front, 1982, 1996, 2006, 2023, and now 2026, has ended not with a decisive battlefield victory, but with a negotiated arrangement that froze the underlying tensions in place. The question is whether this time, with so many structural pillars of the old order already broken, there is an opportunity to build something more durable. Or whether the region is simply lurching toward the next pause before the next round. If this breakdown helped you make sense of a situation that most coverage reduces to headlines and explosions, consider sharing it with someone who's trying to understand what's actually happening. And if you want to stay ahead of how this story develops, because it will develop rapidly, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. The people of Lebanon have survived civil war, occupation, economic collapse, and one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. Their resilience is not in question. What is in question is whether the forces acting on and around their country, forces largely beyond their control, will allow that resilience to matter. That is the question that March 2026 has placed on the table. And the answer, right now, is still being written.